Hello and welcome back to Modern World History. And in this video, we're going to finish out World War II and talk about the Allies' victory. So finally, the Allies are victorious. So in the last few videos, we talked about the fighting in Europe and North Africa, the fighting in Pacific campaign, and then we looked at the Holocaust. And one of the last things we learned was that the Allies did end up having an alliance that enabled them to have a two-front war against Germany. But really, when you think about the way these fronts played out, it wouldn't be just like an east and a west in such the same way as it was with World War One. Really, what you're looking at here is the front to the west, so to speak, would be North Africa and the Mediterranean. Okay. And then you've got kind of Russia fighting over to the east. So remember, the way that the Axis powers are structured is a little different. And also, we're just looking at different times here. And the Axis were already in control of the Balkans, and we still had the fighting that was going on in North Africa. So we have to kind of clean all this up and figure out what happens there. How does it get solved? How do the Allies get ahead? And so you've got General Bernard Montgomery, who went by General Monty, and he is sent to take over British forces in North Africa. Now remember, a few videos ago we talked about how the British were fighting against the Italians, who ended up being reinforced by Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox from Germany. And so Rommel was a far more formidable foe against the British forces in North Africa, and kind of kept the British at bay. But Monty is going to come in and challenge Rommel in Egypt, and then we've got American Dwight D. Eisenhower, the same guy who was going to become the president of the United States later on. He was a general at the time, and he challenged Erwin Rommel from Algeria and Morocco. And so you've kind of got these two closing in, Algeria and Morocco kind of more to the west, and Egypt a little bit more to the east of northern Africa. And they're going to start forming this pincer against Desert Fox. And so Rommel ends up surrendering in May of 1943. Okay, so now the Allies have secured North Africa more or less. Meanwhile, the Battle of Stalingrad is raging on. So remember, we also talked about how after the Battle of Britain, Hitler had initiated Operation Barbarossa. All right, so that's what this is Operation Barbarossa. So Hitler is still trying to take over Russia in August of 1942, and the Germans relentlessly bombed the city of Stalingrad with their Luftwaffe, which is the same as their Air Force. All right. And so the soldiers held fast. They took advantage of the fact that it was a winter. The Germans didn't know what to do with all that Russian cold and winter. They were ill prepared. And we already talked about how Hitler would not allow the Russians to retreat. And here he is saying, nope, no retreat, right? So Hitler wouldn't allow it. And they wanted to cut off the German line with a counterattack. That's what they had done. So the Germans were more or less isolated. They couldn't retreat. Eventually, the Germans are going to be defeated by February 1943, and the cost of winning this. All right, so the Russians are going to have defeated the Germans, but the cost of winning this was really, really high. They lost about 100,000 troops, but Germany was now on the defensive on the Eastern Front, as well as in the Mediterranean. And so it looked like the tide of battle had kind of shifted in Europe. Italy, meanwhile, Stalin had at this point is collaborating with the other allies, with Churchill and with FDR. And so Stalin wants there to be an attack on France. And part of this is because he needs relief, right? But the Allies began their attack in Italy on July the 10th, 1943. And the Allies liberated Italy, all except for the northern part. They discovered Mussolini trying to hide. He was disguised as a regular soldier, and he was trying to escape because at this point Italy was defeated. On April 27th, 1945, they shot him the very next day. The fighting isn't going to end, though, until Germany's defeat. And so at this point, Italy is out of the game. It looked like the Russians have an advantage and finally have the Germans on the defensive on the eastern side, and it looks like this is the beginning of the downhill fall for Hitler and Germany. Meanwhile, we have to talk a little bit about the war on the home front. We talked a little bit in World War One about this idea of total war. Okay, so we're seeing this again, and that is when everyone is kind of focused on the war effort. Civilians went all in for the cause. You got factories converted to making weapons, rationing all goods so that troops can have something, so that resources can be used for making tanks and planes rather than be made or used for making things like cars or consumer goods. Propaganda, war bonds, all these different things were designed to get people in line with the war effort and get them spending money on trying to sponsor it with war bonds and give loans to the country. Women also took advantage of the fact that men were off fighting. Women ran the industries in the United States. You even have women's baseball league would emerge as something that people took part in as a pastime, since there was a lot of the men baseball players had gone into the war, and so you start to see the emergence of the women's baseball leagues in the 1940s due to the war, and so there's actually movies about. There's a movie about that too from the 90s, maybe late 80s, with Madonna and Rosie and all of them, called A League of Their Own. But going back to the end of the war in Europe, D-Day. All right, so this one here is going to be June the 6th, 1944. It's a day in which the Allies had said, we need to get a stronghold in France. From there, we will be able to launch a massive counter invasion to defeat the Germans once and for all. Problem is, the beaches along France, it was very, very, very heavily fortified by the Germans, who kind of was anticipating this offensive. And so recently, we just celebrated 75 years since the D-Day invasion. This may be the last time that we can celebrate with all the people who may still be living that were survivors of this. But I mean, they were told more or less that they may die in this offensive. And so what happened was, you got this group of people that came together and kind of set up like a fake stronghold on the beaches in order to trick the Nazis into thinking that this was going to be the point in which all the troops, mostly Americans and many others as well, were going to enter on the shores of Normandy and then go back and launch this massive invasion into Germany to take to defeat the Germans on the defensive. But they were able to successfully trick the Germans into thinking that was the location, and then they actually entered on to another location on the beach. And even still, it was still very, very heavily fortified. The troops were having to jump off the boats in the water, run on the water. Now, if you guys ever gone to the beach, you've run in the water. It slows you down tremendously. Then on top of that, put a bunch of gear on your back and your clothes and things like that, and your boots. You can imagine that you're probably not running super fast. You're out in the open. You've got machine guns and bombs and things like that coming at you. And a lot of the troops weren't going to make it even on the beach, and many of them made it on the beach, weren't going to make it very far after that. And yet, the offensive actually was a major success and set the stage for the Allies to be able to get a stronghold there in France and then begin their counteroffensive against the Germans. Dwight D. Eisenhower was in charge of this. Hitler, like I said, knew this was happening and didn't know from where. And the Allies did make a dummy headquarters to trick the Germans, and it worked. So actually, PBS NewsHour, just this past year, so somewhere, I think it was probably the June 6th PBS NewsHour episode. Watch it, and you'll know more about this. It was a pretty cool episode, the June 6th, 2019 PBS NewsHour. Anyway, on June 6, 1944 is the largest land and sea invasion in history to date. Germans were barricaded behind thick bunkers. Also, if you ever seen the beginning of Saving Private Ryan, that was D-Day. Allies also lost many soldiers, to the machine guns, to the fact that the Germans were barricaded very well. But it was a major win for the Allies when it's all said and done. Here's a picture of what D-Day would have looked like: the troops jumping off of the boats into the water and then running uphill on the shore. Very, very difficult to do that, and many of them probably expected to die in the process. So these guys are considered to be heroes of their generation, and heroes even today. We hold them in the highest regard for their efforts towards their country and towards freedom. The Battle of the Bulge really was Germany's last try. Okay, so now Germany's fighting this two-front war. They got the Americans coming to reinforce on the western side. They're still facing against and are on the defensive on the eastern side against the Russians, the Soviets, and the Allies were caught off guard actually by this offensive. So the Germans threw everything they had at the Western Front. But at this point, they were too weak. The Allies, even though they were caught off guard, were too strong. And at this point, Germany is forced back into retreat, and it looks pretty sure at this point that Germany is going to fall. And so the Allies begin to close in on Berlin, and Hitler and his fiancee, girlfriend, whoever you want to call her, Eva Braun, committed suicide together, and the war was over. Wait, it was over in Europe. But we still need to finish up the loose ends in the Pacific. So we're going to do that real quick. Last time we talked about the Pacific campaign, we looked at how Japan was at this point on the defensive. The Battle of Midway and then the Battle of Guadalcanal really kind of set them on the defensive. Guadalcanal was their effort. Remember they were doing the practice of island hopping, all right, and they wanted to make sure that Guadalcanal was not going to become the next Japanese stronghold, and they fought for about 6 months, and then actually finally did win, and now the Japanese are on the defensive. And so the Japanese gambled big, kind of like what Hitler did in the Battle of the Bulge. At this point, the Japanese are going to throw everything they have in order to try to take out the Allies' fleet, and if they failed, they'd be completely defeated, and the Admiral kind of knew this, and they did. They failed. The Japanese fleet was completely defeated, and this right here would be the Battle of Leyte Gulf. I'm sorry if I'm not pronouncing that correctly. But this right here is where, at this point, the Japanese they don't have enough of a fleet to really pose a challenge against the Allied forces. And so there is going to be, the Battle of Iwo Jima and Okinawa in some of the bloodiest fighting in the war. These right here, there's been movies and stuff made of these battles as well. We're not going to go into too much detail because we're just trying to cover this in a survey kind of a way. But now, the issue here was, how are we going to finish off the Japanese? Do we invade Japan? Or do we, why do we do this? Going to, I guess, end the conflict soon without more loss of human lives. And so at this point, this here is where we learn about the Manhattan Project. Okay, so Truman, who was the successor to FDR, who had died while in office, gets to be for the first time told about this Manhattan Project. It was something that was classified, only the president knew. Okay, and it's kind of a big deal. So basically, what happens here is the United States had been developing atomic bombs. Right? And we had an atom bomb at this point that was ready to go and that could be used, and Truman was told about how destructive and how devastating it would be, and had to weigh the humanitarian question: is this something that we can do with how many lives would it save versus how many lives would have been lost if we would have launched just like a infantry offensive, like if we would have just invaded Japan as we did with Hitler in Germany. And so Truman ends up giving the go-ahead because he believed, and his advisors or whoever believed, that we would have less casualties if we dropped the bomb that would probably very immediately end the war. And so the first bomb was dropped on the city of Hiroshima, and the second bomb was dropped on the city of Nagasaki. And at this point, the Japanese did accept they did surrender by September 2nd, 1945, and now World War II is completely done. We're totally done. Now we just have to look at the damage and assess what's going on and figure out how we're going to clean it up. So as a report here, I wanted to look at the war costs, the military killed and missing, and civilians killed. And you can see, I'm not going to go over this chart in great detail, but there's a lot of death and casualties and missing, and there's a lot of costs here. You can see that some countries lost more than others, in particular the USSR. Just like in World War I, they lost just a tremendous amount of people. If you ever study geography and you look at population pyramids that show the demographic situation during, I guess before, during, and after World War I and II, you could see where, especially on the male side, you just have these mad, whole generation lost due to these wars. The Nuremberg trials were held in order to bring to justice some of the German leaders that were tried for war crimes. And so, also in Japan, General MacArthur demilitarized Japan. And then, last time around with the Treaty of Versailles, you've got the War Guilt Clause and all that. But what happens here is that MacArthur, rather than punish Japan, they got together and helped with the creation of a new democracy. And so you kind of, it's really weird. And we think about how after World War II, you would think that pretty soon after that, we're allies with Japan. And I think a lot of that has to do with the way that we helped with the reparations there. So the Japanese emperor becomes more or less a ceremonial figurehead, not the, I guess, the same kind of divine ruler or I guess head of state that he would have been. So even today, like, he still exists, but he has more of a, I hope I'm describing this right, more of a Queen of England kind of look and feel than he does an actual leader with governing power. That right there really wraps us up for World War II. And yeah, I know there's a lot more detail we could go into there, but again, we're just kind of covering it as part of a survey course. And I hope you guys got a lot out of that, and I will see you in the next unit. Thanks for watching.